Davis Jr. for World War II Veterans History Project interview. And thank you so much for coming, Mr. Davis. We
You're
do
welcome.
really appreciate it. And with us today is Shakelia Finley, who will help with the interview. So, Mr. Davis, where were you when Pearl Harbor was attacked?
I was in college at Davidson College in North Carolina on the Sunday of VE Day.
And how did you actually hear the news about the attack?
We heard the news shortly after church that Sunday afternoon over the radio. And of course everyone, among all the students, they were extremely excited. And we got together in several groups that afternoon, and they have a tradition at Davidson. On Sunday night, all of the professors open their homes to students after dinner that would like to come by and have a social visit. So a group of us got together and we visited with the colonel who was head of the ROTC. He was known as a PMS&T, and not that he knew a whole lot about what was going on. None of us did. But we wanted to get his insights into what he thought was going on and where this might lead us. So it was a very interesting visit that we had with this colonel.
So you were in the ROTC?
I was in the ROTC at that time.
Do you remember what he said, what his thoughts were with his perspective of already being in the service?
Well, he said, of course, those of us in the Army, and he was speaking about himself, he said, we've known for a long time that this was coming. And he says, this is extremely serious. And he said, we are going to be fighting a very serious army with the Japanese and with the Germans, because we knew that since the Japanese had attacked us, that we were actually in war with the German nation as well as the Japanese nation.
Interesting. Well, could you tell us, you were a junior at Davidson.
No, I was a sophomore
A
at that
sophomore.
time, correct.
Where did you grow up? And if you'll please
Oh,
just...
I'm a native of Atlanta.
Native Atlanta. And when
Attended school,
Great.
public schools here, boys high school.
And when were you born? Your birthday?
I was born in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm. And the date?
April 28th of 23.
So you went to Boys High,
Correct.
then on to Davidson.
And then on to Davidson.
And what were you studying at Davidson?
Studying business.
I see. Now, did you, after that happened, then what? Did you continue on at Davidson?
Well, shortly after we were attacked, maybe 2 to 3 months, we were visited by a recruitment team, a U.S. Army recruitment team. And they called a special meeting of the student body and gave the recruitment team as much time as they wanted to try and induce as many of us as possible to enlist in what at that time was known as the Enlisted Reserve Corps, ERC. And the several people on this team said, now fellas, if you will enlist, we can assure you that you will not be called to active duty and you will be able to finish your 4 years of college. And of course, they came back, I guess, a week later, and those that were interested in trying to complete their, or having time to complete their college training, signed for the Enlisted Reserve Corps. In other words, we were officially in the Army on a non-active duty basis. And then approximately 2 to 3 months after that, all of us, and there were several hundred that had enlisted, we were suddenly called to active duty. And most of us that were called from Davidson were assigned to basic infantry training at Camp Croft, which is near Spartanburg, South Carolina. And this was in the summer months, and there's no hotter place in the United States than Camp Croft, South Carolina in the summertime. So we had 3 months of basic training at Camp Croft, and with many hikes on those dusty troop training trails that they had. And after 3 months at Camp Croft, the Army Specialized Training Program was just beginning to crank up for those in the Army that were interested in pursuing an engineering course that the Army offered. And you had to have a high school degree, you had to have some college, and then you had to pass several tests, and one of them was an aptitude test, etc., etc. But anyway, most of us that applied, we were accepted, and we were then transferred from the infantry to the cadet corps of the Army Specialized Training Program, known as ASTP, as I mentioned. And I was assigned to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., which has, as you all probably know, one of the finest foreign service schools in the country. That's what it's known for. But they also had an engineering school. So we were told at that time that this was a 2-year engineering course with all of the engineering courses, physics, chemistry, algebra, and so on and so forth. And that upon successfully completing this course, we'd be commissioned not second lieutenants, but first lieutenants. And that was what we thought was a little bit unusual, but this was a new course. But anyway, we were very busy there, and we had to study. We had a lot of homework at night. It wasn't any crit course, and quite a few of the fellas flunked out. I mean, they just didn't want to go the full course with that. But anyway, those of us that remained in school, after a little over 1 full year, orders came through one day from Washington, from the Pentagon, assigning us to the infantry because the conditions in Europe were very serious at that time, and they needed more infantrymen transferred to the European theater. So we found ourselves 3 or 4 days later, after the order came through, on a troop train to Camp Swift, Texas, a little place out in the desert, the end of the earth, called Bastrop, B-A-S-T-R-O-P, which is east of Austin, Texas. So we were there in another basic training for myself, and another basic training course for 3 months. And then we received our orders to report to Fort Dix, New Jersey, to prepare going overseas. So we were at Fort Dix for a month. We were waiting our orders to transfer to Camp Kilmer as soon as they had enough troop ships in the port at Camp Kilmer for a full convoy. And we found out at that time that a full convoy was approximately 75 to 100 troop ships. So we embarked at Camp Kilmer, and we were immediately told that every night that right at dusk that we would get the order from the bridge of our particular ship to close all hatches and dog them down. And no more smoking except inside of the ship. So we embarked, and for the first 36 hours, we had a Navy blimp, just like a Goodyear type blimp, that was the mother security ship, umbrella you might say, over the 70 ship convoy. And after 36 hours, they had to turn back and go back to their base in New Jersey, because that was their fuel, their mileage range for the amount of fuel that they could carry. And then we also had two Navy destroyer escorts with us. And for a convoy of that size, they really should have had anywhere from 5 to 10 destroyer escorts. So really, two, they call the destroyer escort DEs, only two DEs to completely circle the convoy at all times. It was a rather thin security cover. So anyway, the North Atlantic, and that was our route when we knew we were headed towards England. We didn't know where we would debark, but anyway, the North Atlantic in the winter, the month of October, is the worst month of the year as far as storms are concerned. And the ship, the storms that we had for the 10 days that it took us to cross the North Atlantic, we were constantly in storms. I mean, the ship just rolling as far one way as it'd go, and then it would roll the other way. And there were many soldiers on this troop ship that they were so seasick that they actually could not get out of their bunk, and they remained in their bunk for the whole 10 days. But anyway, we approached England, and we didn't know it at the time, but we were headed for Weymouth, England, which is on the Channel coast. And the Germans had mined the English coast as well as the French coast, up and down the entire length of it. But the British Navy had cleared a 50-foot channel for us to go into the port of Weymouth, just simply to drop anchor and spend the night. And we were the first troops to leave America and go straight to France without going through a staging area in England. That's where you would debark, and then you would remain in a staging area compound there until they were ready to ship you across the channel or wherever you were to be stationed from there. But anyway, after one night, we pulled up anchor, we pulled out of Weymouth, and we crossed the channel. The channel can be extremely rough, and I don't believe it could have been any rough as far as the seas in this convoy of 76 ships trying to cross the English Channel. And so finally, and of course no one knew where we were going to land in France, but anyway, we pulled close up to the shore of Cherbourg. And Cherbourg had just already been devastated. I mean, had just been bummed. All of the docks and all of the concrete and everything were just in utter chaos. So there was no way that our convoy could pull in there and actually pull up at one of the docks. So the only way that we could be all floated was to have the U.S. Army Transportation Corps. They had these little small ships, they called them lighters. And these lighters could come right up to the side of each ship, and they would drop the ladders, and then if the seas were calm enough, then we could board one of these lighters, and they would take us into a temporary shore dock there where they could offload us. But the channel where we were, and we were sitting out from the Cherbourg maybe a mile and a half. It was so rough that we sat out there like a cork bobbing up and down in the sea for 3 days until the seas calmed enough to where our 76 ship convoy could be offloaded. But anyway, we got ashore and we immediately trooped in the mud, everything was muddy over there, to where we were in Normandy, and we went to hedgerows. Normandy is a big apple country. I mean, they grow a lot of apples in Normandy. And they had these square hedgerows, and they were large enough, at least the hedgerows that we went to, that they could accommodate a company. And our company had approximately 400 personnel. But they warned us, and they were very, very emphatic about this. They said that even though the Germans have moved on south, they've been pushed southward by our troops, but they have left every hedgerow heavily mined. Now these hedgerows are little stones, 5, 10, 15 inches long, that the French built, and they had all these hedgerows had overgrown with all kind of I guess you'd say trees and vines and things like that. But there was one entrance just wide enough for one person, single file, to get into the hedgerow. And they said, under no circumstances do any of you enter this hedgerow or leave this hedgerow except by this one opening that has been cleared. So we understood the warning pretty well, but some other troops in some other hedgerows, they didn't take it too seriously. And we were in this hedgerow, living in our pup tents. It was still raining, and it rained every day for 30 days, a little over 30 days until we were ready to move out. And day and night, you'd hear kaboom, and some soldier in some other hedgerow had failed to heed the warning and had evidently tried to get out of the camp or slip out of camp, maybe slip back in, and had tried to cross over one of these hedgerows other than the designated place that he should have been. So, I mean, this went on for 30 days, and of course, anybody that steps on a German mine, of course, as everyone knows, that's the end of it. I mean, he's a casualty of the war. But anyway, after 30 days, how are we coming on the time?
Doing great.
All right. Anyway, after 30 days, we got orders to march to the nearest railhead, which was St. Lo, and it had already been taken by the Americans at that time. And so we marched in mud a little over 30 miles to this railhead. And we got to the railhead, there was this train. It had an American steam engine that was manufactured by the Bulge Locomotive Works. And it was there ready to go just as soon as we could load up. But what we were going to board were not passengers cars, but what is known as 40 and 8 boxcars. And most people, of course, have heard about the 40 and 8 boxcars. These French boxcars would hold 8 horses, had 8 chevaux written on the side of it, or 40 personnes, P-E-R-S-O-N-N-E-S, 40 persons. Well, we boarded this boxcar, and our platoon, which was about 48 or 49, it would barely hold us, just really squatting down or standing up. And all of these boxcars had been previously heavily strafed by the German Luftwaffe at some previous time. And with the rain still coming down, that all of these holes, the rain was just pouring in on us all the time. The only way we could sleep is that we could just line up the best we could, just body after body after body. And if anybody wanted to turn over, everybody had to turn over at the same time to go from the left side to the right side. But we started out, and the troop train had to travel very, very slow because all the Germans had blown out all of the bridges in France, and they were constantly ahead of us, blowing out any bridge that was being used by, whether it was a motorized convoy or whether it was a troop train. So our Corps of Engineers would immediately move in, and they would rebuild a temporary bridge across a river or ravine or whatever it was. So the engineer could not travel more than 5 miles an hour maximum across any of these temporary bridges, engineer bridges. So it took us approximately 5 days to cross from the time leaving St. Lo, and we knew we were headed somewhere in Germany. But we had to go across France, across Belgium, a little bit of Holland, up into Germany. And every time we would stop, and there were many stops we had to make, because the tracks, you can imagine a railroad bed just going up and down and up and down. And we stopped so many times, sometimes 10 to 15 times in a mile. And every time we would stop, if we were near a little village, the French mothers would come with their children. There weren't too many men left around, but they would come with the children, and they would go up to each boxcar, and they would ask, and they knew the word for candy, and of course cigarettes for Papa, and food, any kind of food that we might have. And of course everybody was throwing various things off to them that they thought that the kids would like. But I mean, this went on all the way. Then one night we were crossing Belgium, and it was very clear that night, and we all heard a fluttering sound, and somebody said V1 missile, a V1 missile. And it was a guided missile that the Germans, of course, had these missile launches on the coast of France, the coast of Belgium, and also I think Germany. And they were sending these over to London. And those things would go over about every 5 to 10 minutes during the night. And as it passed over with this fluttering sound, you could look at the jet exhaust, which was a bright orange jet exhaust coming out, and then they would just flutter on into the distance. So that was kind of an eerie sound to have, every night that we were going across Belgium. But anyway, we finally came to the farthest eastern railhead, where we debarked, and there were army trucks there that were ready to take us up into Germany. So they took us to a little German village right on the French-German border called Aachen, A-A-C-H-E-N. And it also has a French name, Aux, A-U-X, La Chapelle, C-H-A-P-E-L-L-E. But anyway, we were led into this town of Aachen, which on the far side of Aachen was already held by the German. Of course, we were told that the Germans were there, and we were assigned a house, a real nice German house that the Germans had left very suddenly. And on the first floor of this house, you could see where there had been a recent fire in the fireplace, and the pictures sitting on the dressers and on the tables where the German family had occupied. I mean, the pictures were just still sitting right there, just like the family would be back in a few minutes or a few hours. And it was a very sad thing, even though we hated the Germans, to see the devastation. And I mean, this particular house, most of the roof had been strafed, and part of the wall had caved in. But anyway, we were assigned the basement of this home. And before we went in there, we wondered, well, now how is our particular platoon going to get in this basement? Well, we were led down these steps. But going down these steps, we noticed that this whole first floor was 6 inches of reinforced concrete, which we found later that all the houses in that little town of Aachen had reinforced concrete over each basement. So the Germans knew that this war was coming on for a long, long time. But we felt fairly safe down with that reinforced concrete above us. But one thing we had to do, we had to stand guard duty, certain ones of us, for 2 hours every night, 2 hours on, 2 hours off. And because the Germans were so close, the Germans were sending out patrols each night. And I mean, it was dark in this little town, no lights or any activity. And every once in a while you'd hear a German patrol with their burp guns going brrrr. And you hear another one over on another street brrrr. And of course we knew that the Germans were real close. But anyway, we stayed there probably 6 to 7 days, and then we got the order to get ready to pack up everything and get ready to move up. And our objective was going to be the Ruhr River crossing, not the Rhine, but the Ruhr River. And we knew that was going to be a real heavy engagement with the Germans trying to get to the Ruhr River. But anyway, we moved on out, and we were going through little villages and down a dirt road, and we were being shelled by the German 88 shells all the time. So as our column would move, we had to maintain a distance of at least 25 to 50 feet between each person, so that if a German 88 shell did get in, that it wouldn't take out more than one or two. One shell wouldn't take out more than 1 or 2 men at a time. But we were constantly shelled, and we, of course, engaging the Germans on our left and on our right that had the small arms fire and also mortars. And I was in a mortar squad with 60 millimeter mortars. The Germans really hated our 60 millimeter mortars, because actually we were known that we could send a mortar up like you hit a lob with a tennis ball, and lob this mortar right over into a German opposition. And if we knew exactly where that German opposition was situated, we could literally put our mortar right in the pocket of a German. So what we did, we would fire 3 mortar rounds real fast. You drop them in this tube, and this is just a tube that has a base plate and a bipod, just 2 steel angle braces coming up. We would fire 3 of those. We'd pick up the base plate and the tube and the bipod, and we'd move just as fast as we could, maybe 50 yards to the left or to the right or somewhere, because we knew those Germans could tell. They had ways of telling exactly what our position was, that they were going to be lobbing mortars right back at us. So anyway, that's what we did. And then late one afternoon, we were under heavy artillery fire from German 88 millimeters. And these German 88 millimeters, there was the finest piece of armament that any army in Europe had. With the German 88 millimeter shell, the Germans could use this as an anti-tank gun. In other words, if an American tank was coming to them, they could lower that. It was on a trailer with four wheels on it, and it was not self-propelled. It had to be either pushed or pulled by some type of a motorized vehicles by the German. But anyway, they could use it as an anti-tank gun. Then they could use it as an artillery piece, where they could lob these shells. I would guess the range, if I remember, maybe 8 to 10 miles maximum. Or they could use it as an anti-aircraft gun. Well, Americans didn't have any type of an instrument or any type of a piece of armament that could be used 3 ways. And that's one reason that the Germans almost won the war in Europe, because they did have such fine armaments. But anyway, one afternoon I started to see as we were in this German, advancing in this German apple orchard. And these were old apple trees with huge trunks on them. And of course, when those rounds started coming in, we didn't have time to dig a foxhole, which normally you would do if you could. But these shells kept lobbing in, and they were creeping closer and closer to us. They call that zeroing in. And they probably had a forward observer, German forward observer, and that was with a radio or some type of communication, calling back to that particular battery and telling them where it was hitting. But anyway, they were coming close to us, so we were just flat on our stomachs in this German apple orchard. And one of the shells apparently hit the trunk of this apple tree that we were under, and that detonated the shell. Well, when it detonated the shell, that shrapnel from this German 88 shell, it just sprayed down on all of us, large pieces and small pieces of shrapnel. So I was unfortunate enough to get some shrapnel. I was hit in 2 places, once in the hand, and then had a piece to go across my ankle and sever a tendon and part of my ankle. Well, then of course I couldn't walk, and I was immediately picked up by one of our own medics, as we call them, and put in they call the ambulances meat wagons in the armies at that time. And so several of us were put in this meat wagon, and we were transported back to the battalion aid station. And we were treated temporarily at this battalion aid station. Some of them just got a bandage if it was a superficial type wound, and they were shipped right on back to their unit. And those of us that couldn't walk or had a serious type wound, we were then transported back to an Army field hospital. Well, these Army field hospitals were long tent hospitals. And I guess some of those tents were the distance of maybe half the distance of a football field. And you could see from one end of the tent all the way down to the other. They were just bunk beds, just canvas bunk beds. And they had row after row of these Army field hospitals there that really were equipped to treat our troops with most any type of wound that they had. But anyway, a number of us, and by the way, while we were there, it was at Liège, Belgium, and we were shelled a lot while we were in that hospital. But fortunately, none of the shells hit right at the hospital. I guess they were more interested in trying to stop active troops that had armor that could cause them problems. But anyway, we were transported on a troop train to a French port, and at this French port, we were taken by a litter, those that couldn't walk, and put on this English hospital ship. And we were transported as soon as the ship was loaded across the English Channel to south. I'm trying to think of the name of that big port. Anyway, we were transported to this large English port, and there we were put on a English troop train. We called it a limey train, and then we were transported up to the Malvern Hills of England, which is about maybe 80 miles northeast of London. And none of the Germans really had gotten that far as shelling this particular area, because the V-1 missiles and the V-2 missiles, well, most of them were headed towards London, and they were landed in the London area. But anyway, we were unloaded at this United States Army General Hospital, and there was a group of 5 permanent type hospitals in this area, and it was the hospitals that were well equipped as any American hospital, so that they could hopefully get you in good enough condition where you could go back to your unit. But anyway, because I had infection, that serious infection that set in with my ankle, they almost amputated my ankle due to this serious infection, that I remained in that hospital recuperating for approximately 10 months. Okay. And after 10 months, I was sent to a replacement depot, as they called it, to be assigned to some other military establishment. I didn't know whether I was going back to France or going to Belgium or wherever. But anyway, I was assigned to Eisenhower's staff in Paris in the entertainment branch. The entertainment branch for the entire European theater was located in Paris in the Shell Oil Company building. And this entertainment branch, we handled all of the what we call Jeep shows, where we would send these Jeeps up for small shows to the troops, and we would entertain large contingent of American soldiers, and then we produced shows there like South Pacific, for instance, very elaborate shows that was well done as anything on a Broadway. And I was assigned to an Army major that was head of this entertainment for the Army. Name was Josh Logan, Logan, and he's deceased now, but he was a well-known producer of Broadway shows and also theater, movie type things. And so our office, we took over the Clay Bear Hotel, so we actually lived there, and well, the enlisted men lived there, and we had our offices there. Now, the officers from Major on up lived in a very famous French hotel that's still there called Avenue George V, George V. I know you all have heard of it. And so the generals and as I say, maybe above the rank, they lived there. It was heavily guarded. They had the best of Army food that anyone would want. And then we took care of all of the movie stars, the women and the men, being sent over from the state. How are we doing on
Good.
time?
About 20 more minutes.
All right.
Mr. Davis, I wanted to ask a question. Do you remember the date approximately when your injury occurred? Maybe year, season?
It was 45, about last part of November of 45 as well as I can remember.
And then when did you...
Because it was, and this was on our way as we were approaching the Royal River.
Okay.
We were moving forward. And the Battle of the Bulge, by the way, started in, I believe it was December the 16th of 45, which was the worst engagement that our infantry troops or any of our troops were involved with. So anyway, while I was in the hospital, I'll just back up since you asked that question. While I was in this 58th General Hospital, the Battle of the Bulge suddenly started. And it was so serious that it was the first time in European theater where our C-47 transport planes were landing on hastily prepared strips right close to the front. And they were taking the wounded and immediately filling up those C-47 troops, and they were bringing them direct back to our group of 5 general hospitals in the Marvin Hills, and landing them right there and bringing them right into the hospital. So this, and I can remember one poor soldier was brought in. He was put on the bunk late one night right next to me, and of course I'd been there a while and I knew some of the doctors pretty well, and several of the doctors were right around both sides of this poor fella, and he had been a shell of some type had actually gone through his stomach, this German shell, and the doctors just shook their head. And as they got up to leave, they did everything they could for him, giving him morphine and so forth. Shook his head and he told me, just whispered, he said, he won't make it through the night. And sure enough, the next morning they came in and took him out and he passed away. But anyway, those doctors said that they never, during the entire European theater, had seen men. See, it was very, very cold, bitter cold during that Battle of Bulge. And they've never seen men that were actively wounded as seriously as they were during this Battle of the Bulge, in which we had very thin forces guarding that area at the time, and the Germans just came in with that last ditch maneuver, thinking maybe we can turn this war around. Of course, all of us know they couldn't. So anyway. I was in Paris on VE Day, and I went over to the Eiffel Tower, and the Eiffel Tower was located at a round intersection called the Trocadero, and the Palais de Châtelet was a big theater right there, and the French had just completed this theater, beautiful theater, right before World War II. and they had this big terrace right out on the front of it, a marble terrace with all sorts of statues, and the Palais de Châtelet was built up on this hill, and you could look down on the Seine River, and right across the Seine River was the Eiffel Tower. I mean, a gorgeous place to have this theater. And I had my camera there, we just taking black and white, that's all we had, no color back then. And so I saw this airplane, and it was a bimotor, two-motored American plane. And down at the far end, as you would look past the Eiffel Tower, was the West Point of France. It's called the Militaire École de France, the Military School of France. And anyway, this plane came over that military facility and lined up on this long mall, just like the Washington Mall. I mean, it must have been a mile long, maybe a little more. And he was hedgehog. He came right down the mall towards us. And I said, I wonder when he's going to bank up, or he's going to hit the Eiffel Tower. He didn't hit the Eiffel Tower. He came under the two arches that are lined up with that mall, and he came right under that. And because I was standing right in front of that Palais de Châtelet, he had to bank up very, very steep to miss that. And there were, this was what the U.S. Air Force that time, it was called U.S. Army Air Corps at that time. This ship was an AT-11, which is it's a training ship that they used a lot in training our pilots before they got into really serious training. But anyway, he banked up and he was safe. And of course, if anybody else had been there that was in the U.S. Army Air Corps, I'm talking about a general and all, they probably would have busted both of them right out of the Army as soon as they landed. But believe it or not, I got a picture of that, and I have lost that picture somewhere. I'd give anything in the world if I still had a picture of it. But anyway, I was there in Paris. It was great duty. We had our own restaurant on the Champs-Élysées that was taken over by the Army. We had French chefs in there, French waitresses that took care of us, and it was right on the corner of Rue de, I can't think of that name just at the moment, but anyway, it was on the corner of this street that crossed the Champs-Élysées, and our building, the Shell building, was on the other side of it, down 2 blocks. And across from the Shell building was where the wax had taken over the entire hotel. And the wax, of course, the trucks would come there every morning, and they were all in uniform, of course. They'd pick them up, and they would take them to the various Army offices, because Paris was full of them at that time, since it was Eisenhower's headquarters. They'd take them to work, and then they'd bring them back in every afternoon. But we didn't have, those of us in our office and entertainment brand, we didn't have anything to do with them, because I tell you, they were a rough bunch. I mean, they were just about as rough as any male soldiers that you would encounter anywhere. And the songs that they would sing when they were riding in those open, they were so glad to be off duty, coming back to their hotel. I mean, it was really something to behold. But anyway, our entertainment branch, we had our own C-47 where we could transport our soldiers, entertainment soldiers, the scenery, that we get a lot of scenery in there. We got the entertainers and so forth. So we flew all over Europe, and after VE Day, in entertaining our troops. And then we had these little Jeep shows that with 4 or 5 Jeeps that would take a smaller show up into the various armies as that wanted to be entertained. And I had a friend of mine that was stationed in Paris that was with the he was with the Army Air Corps, the troop transport part of it, but they didn't have many troops to transport. So every time that he had a trip to some place like Nice, France, or Berlin, Germany, which had been taken, or Salzburg, and I was in school with him at Boys High School. He was name was Alan Jackson, and he was one year ahead of me, and he was a captain, just having a great time flying. He loved to fly, but he invited me to fly anytime I had a day off on any of these, and I mean they were all official flights. I mean they wouldn't let anybody just get on a plane and just fly just because they wanted to go somewhere. But anyway, I flew with Alan, and he let me sit in the co-pilot seat and fly the plane some after we got up in the air. And I remember Berlin, when we landed in Berlin, the main airport at that time, of course, had apartments, 3- and 4-story apartment buildings all the way around the airport there. And he had some supplies to take up there, and we landed no problem. But when we got ready to take off, he went down to the end of this runway. He revved up both of the engines on this C-47. He and his co-pilot held the brakes as long as they could, and they let go because the runways in this field were very short, and all these bummed out apartments, and I mean everything was bummed out in Berlin. There wasn't a building left standing anywhere, and they had to be sure that they could clear all of these bummed out buildings. And I guess that's the scariest I've ever been in taking off in an airplane. But I mean, we cleared it, and we came on back to Paris and landed safely. On another trip, we went to Nice, and at that time, Nice just had one airstrip that paralleled the beach there. And the day or two previous to our flying into Nice, this B-17 had crash landed. I don't know why, but it had crash landed on that one airstrip, and the Army had taken a bulldozer and had just pushed the entire C-47 right off of the runway so it could become operational immediately. But it was a terrible sight to see. But anyway, we took trips. They arranged trips for the troops to go to Switzerland after the war had ended. Those troops that were still left and still didn't have enough points to come home, and they had 7-day trips to Switzerland, and you could choose the particular. They had, I think, 8 separate trips, and you could choose which area you wanted to go to. And I went down on the train, and I managed to get some grapefruit and oranges, and I'm talking about fresh oranges, fresh grapefruit, bananas that our French restaurant had, and several items of canned goods, and I took them with me in my knapsack. And of course it was very difficult to get anything into Switzerland at that time, but I managed to get those items, I won't tell you how, past security. And because I knew that they'd only let us take in $10, and we could convert it only American dollars. And this was the European American dollars. They weren't worth anything in America. We could only convert I believe it was $20 into Swiss francs. Well, even then you couldn't buy much, and I wanted to buy a watch for my mother and father. So anyway, I knew I could barter with this food that I had. So anyway, I got past the French security, and after about the third or fourth day in Zurich, I found the name of a Swiss company that had this office in an upstairs showroom, and I went in there and bought a man's watch, and this was a watch that I'd never seen in the States. It had the phase of the moon on them, and it had the day of the date, and it had the day of the week and all that. Of course, those watches are commonplace now, but I'd never seen a type watch, so I thought my father would enjoy that. And then I was fortunate enough to get my mother an Omega watch, then a woman's watch. So anyway, that bartering came in handy. But the interesting thing, when we on this train and we were leaving France and going from Paris down to Switzerland, the French, all the villages were in a devastation, and the French were just barely getting by, eking out, living with their farms and so forth. And then we went through this tunnel, and when we came through this tunnel and came into Switzerland, we came into this city on the west side of Switzerland called Basel, B-A-S-E-L, and pretty good sized city, and nothing had been devastated there. It was just like you were in another world, maybe up in heaven someplace, and no devastation. There was transportation and so forth, and the shops were full of clothes and watches and all types of merchandise. And then the Swiss, of course, have their own train system, which is the finest electric train system in the world. And so we had no problem getting around whatsoever on those Swiss trains. But it was a very fine trip to see some part of the world that was still normal again. But anyway, it was a great trip. How much more time do we have now?
We have 2 more minutes, a little under 2 minutes on this tape.
Well, any questions you want to ask me? I've done a
Well,
lot of
what was
talking.
we might need to put in another tape, but what was the feeling in Paris on the E-Day? Was it just sheer exuberance?
Pandemonium everywhere. I mean, just from curbstone to curbstone, nothing but just Frenchmen, Americans. There were Englishmen, of course, and people from Holland, Belgium, and all that were there, and you could hardly move. But it was just a wild scene. It's something that, of course, you'll never forget as long as you live, you know. But it was an interesting place to be. And of course, there were a lot of drunk people there at that time. A lot of them had visited French cafes, and there was plenty of alcohol flowing that particular day. And the French, they were ingenious. Of course, there was no gasoline for the French civilians, but what a lot of them had done, they had taken a hot water heater out of their home or wherever they could get a hot water heater, and they had built a platform out from the rear of their car, attached to the rear bumper, and they had put the this water tank, and they had converted the engine to propane gas. They could get propane gas, and you'd see these French Renaults, R-E-N-A-U-L-T-S, going around Paris with this water tank right on the back of the bumper, you know. And I mean, they would get along fine. And a lot of the buses had that propane gas on them too. The old French didn't have any new buses, but the old buses, and they were maintaining routes with the old buses, and it was interesting to see that. And if you got another minute, I can tell you about London during the war.
Maybe we should pause right